Ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, this is a film about trickery and fraud, about lies. Tell it by the fireside or in a marketplace or in a movie. Almost any story is almost certainly some kind of lie. But not this time. No, this is a promise. Everything you'll hear from us is really true and based on solid facts.
Hello, welcome to Vibration Cinema, the Altered Destiny of Film. Off bat, I gotta admit that this episode on realism really beat my ass. Because I don't believe that film indexes reality in any meaningful way, and I don't think that that's the destiny of cinema, and it was really hard to get a handle on what the actual take should be. First I thought about mounting a critique of Bazin, whom I loathe, and Krakauer, but I got bored rereading their works. But part of that critique was to warn of the dangers of a realist aesthetic, which is used by empire to launder imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy through what Bazin calls the impassivity of the lens. How documentation, that realist fantasy, is actually an act that constitutes reality. Nothing so passive like recording or reflecting, and certainly not without any input from the camera operator. One thinks of Black Hawk Down or Nomadland or Hurt Locker or Cops in this regard, how film is a part of the chorus of laws, political speech, and news that misframes our understanding of reality to justify dominator ideology. I toyed with looking at various national ideas of realism to chart how the real is culturally inflected. For example, the realism in Italian neorealism had more to do with the new economic and political conditions Italians faced after World War II than anything to do with indexing the real. I mean, come on, they were using rain machines for Christ's sakes.
It's not realistic. It's just not realistic.
I then set up an episode looking at Samuel Taylor Coleridge's notion of suspension of disbelief, which asserts that the audience's response to the human interest in the truth of a story outweigh whatever fantastical elements might be employed to tell that story. Truth, of course, is something that needs to be investigated, but what I was interested in was how Coleridge's point does not really square with modern invocations of his phrase as it relates specifically to CG VFX. And I was going to chronicle directors like Powell and Pressburger, Suzuki, Buñuel, Méliès, Obayashi, and Cocteau, who use practical effects, and practical effects are very much lauded for its tautological relationship to the real, but these directors use them to fantastical ends. And I wanted to ask the question that if we take proximity to the real out of the equation, what then makes good CG? And I was going to use Daniel Plainview and Anton Chigurh as examples of what this new rubric could look like. These are not among the best and the most beloved characters of the 21st century because they resemble anything like real humans. They're little more than avatars of greed and death, respectively, but they're so committed to the bit and they performed with such intensity that there's no denying their greatness. And I wanted to ask if we could measure CG not by its proximity to the real, but by the force of its metaphoric punch. Part of the reason why it was so difficult to nail down this episode was because there are so many ways to talk about realism, because there are so many iterations of realism, which of course shift with the sands of time. And it's ultimately really a conversation about degrees. Even Bazin knows that if the camera was able to produce an image that perfectly one-to-ones with reality, it would cease to be cinema.
Every time Black Panther is on screen fighting bad guys, there's no tension because there's no weight to him. He doesn't feel like a real person fighting other real people with real stakes. Why? Because he's literally a cartoon, completely computer generated, not a stuntman in a suit. During the climax, all the tension the movie had built up melted away from me as two cartoon Black Panthers fought in a completely computer generated environment. Again, the fight had no real weight to it. And by weight, I don't mean emotional weight, I mean the characters literally look weightless. They're computer generated puppets, not subject to the rules of physics.
How does this not sound like a Neil deGrasse Tyson rant about spaceships making noise and Star Wars or some bullshit? Like it's getting to the point of like, loser! Sometimes I feel like I'm missing something because movies really are just people's make-em-up friends going on adventures, which is cute. It's story time or show and tell, but like don't try to convince me of your delusions because to me, that's a triple Lindy backflip half double twist into the uncanny valley. The main problem that I realize that I have with realism is how it limits our imagination of what film can do. Realism relegates cinema to the ultimate trompe-l'oeil art. As long as film doesn't agitate your practices of looking, it's good. Films, and I would say questionable, ability to index reality structures our common sense practices of film, even when the film isn't necessarily meant to be realistic.
He moves his head and like the hat actually flaps and whatnot. That's an actual thing you have to do.
Yeah, that was fun to do actually. The hat actually was probably harder to nail than the coat.
What?
Yeah, because how does that hat move into water? Probably that's maybe not like 100% realistic.
It feels realistic enough that I don't notice it.
Yeah.
And that's the point, right?
This is like such a myopic understanding of VFX, and it's indicative of why the David Fincher school of let's throw some CG dust out of focus in the background is so lauded. The unreal elements are minimized to such a degree, or at the very least index reality to a point that they're imperceptible.
Visual effects artists combine incredible artistry and technical skill, toiling over shots for hours, and if they do their job well, nobody even notices it.
And this is something that doesn't square in my mind, lauding invisibility as the highest quality in a visual medium. And it's not just VFX. Writers are discouraged from being visual, which I think says a lot about motion pictures. Good cinematography is when you don't notice the camera. Everybody is taught invisible editing is the paramount form of editing. Great acting is when a performer disappears into the character. I don't understand this mentality, and I think it's born out of these assumptions of the cinema as an inherently realistic art form, where the manipulations of the camera are used to hide any authorial intent. And what the fuck does this even mean? Intensified realism? How the fuck is the camera moving through an Ethiopian mind and out of Adam Sandler's ass, removing direct signs of control and craft? Nothing about Uncut Gems is invisible. It's even more than just visible, it's palpable. This movie physically assaults you, your ears, your eyes, your heart rate. I know people who had a panic attack watching it, and while it's not an experience that I would like to repeat by any means, there is something so unique about Uncut Gems, and that is what vibration cinema seeks, experiences, like Go Girl, Give Us Something. I've been thinking a lot about texture recently, how film stock and lens characteristics, even the distortion of motion create this, for lack of a better phrase, visual tactility. And if you were in the SOC from October to December in 2016, you could hear me proselytizing about the chromatic aberration and moonlight echoing through the halls. I really, really love that shit. Michael Mann is someone who I also think about a lot in this regard. His films are considered heightened realism or new action realism. Yeah, sure, okay, I've made up words before too, but goddamn, Thief and Heat, Al Pacino at LAX and those fucking bokehs, that's my shit. And Mann is also one of the few big name directors who lean into the textures of digital without processing them to imitate celluloid. There's a quality to those Miami Vice night scenes that really fascinates me. AJ described to us once what he wanted to do on Crooklyn. He was in the kitchen cooking up a development process that would make Crooklyn look like the old Jet magazine sitting on top of the back of the toilet. The covers faded and the colors warped by the steam of the shower. And I'd curse Spike Lee every day for being such a fucking coward for blocking it. Usually the first thing that Bradford Young does is black out the ceiling, and he'll occasionally black out the floor and whichever walls aren't being lensed. What he's doing is manipulating the physics of light for a particular affectivity.
You're in a visual effects sequence and your character's doing something and you want it to feel as if it's the film you would shoot, and we get out in these situations where we've got a long walk and talk, and because of the environment that we're in and because of the tools we have, we're not going to walk. You can, but in general, people don't walk with a 12 by for negative fill the whole walk. But when we go do visual effects stuff, we forget that it's a visual effect. You're lighting it, so you can do whatever you want. Right? Ultimately, that's what we want anyway. If we were shooting in real time, in a real space, we'd say, man, I want the whole block negative fill. I want this whole street. I just want to put one big solid all the way down the block. And you would try, you would try to do that. What's great about doing films in the sort of visual effects space is that you can then do that. You can just say, okay, I got all my lights hanging from the ceiling, wherever they are. This side of the stage, I'm turning it all off. And on this side of the stage, I'm turning all the lights on. And for a split second, you say to yourself, that doesn't look real. It doesn't look like what it would look like if you were outside, really. But it's like, yeah, well, even when you're outside, you're like, I don't like the way this looks, so let me add an egg. And so the hard part, but the beautiful part is like, don't question your instincts. Do what feels right. And you can come up with the logic for it.
And this is when the video clicked for me. The iterations of the video that were just a critique of realism weren't really productive. First of all, realism can be summarily rejected in 4 sentences.
It's just a movie. It's pretend. You're an adult, you should know that.
So a whole video really isn't warranted. And while vibration cinema does challenge common sense notions of filmmaking, it needs to be productive also. Thinking about texture made me realize that I can use a conversation about realism to put a tenet of vibration cinema into relief, what I'll dare to call visual pleasure. Representing the world does not necessarily mean indexing it, and I think how one chooses to represent the world in cinema is more interesting than tricking the eye into believing that what is on screen has any substantial proximity to the real. And animation is instructive here for me. These unique art styles give the eyes a little bit of that old razzle-dazzle that I love so much, and despite being objective, of course, the camera does manipulate the pro-filmic event, but given an artist's necessary intervention into the representational process in animation, this is a field where people are celebrated for how they choose to represent the world. And I want to see all the various ways that we can think of to represent the world with the camera's manipulation. So I love when live action films try to translate the brush onto the screen, how Color of Pomegranates takes inspiration from Eastern Orthodox frescoes, or how green screen is used in The Mill and the Cross to evoke the work of Peter Bruegel. And this is when I started thinking about experience and texture and the metaphoric punches. I guess this is in some form an incarnation of Vertov again, but vibration cinema sees the joy and the pleasure of showing something as a filmmaker and being shown something as a viewer. It's why earlier when I said that movies are like show and tell, I meant it sincerely. And it's not a wholesale rejection of realism, which is itself a style. Like, Lord knows that I love Toland's work on Grapes of Wrath, and at least at the time I remember liking Happy-Go-Lucky, which despite using a realist style, got flack because no real person can be as happy or as kind as Poppy. Which reminds me to hammer in the point that I hate how realism is expected to be dreary, self-serious, and unfun. You need a little vibrancy in vibration cinema, you know? In fairness, when realism is employed for a particular effect, it does have its own intriguing textures. For example, in spite of its austerity, New German cinema produced films like In a Year of 13 Moons, which are visually lush in their own brutal way, and Japanese New Wave toyed with mockumentary to political ends, like in Death by Hanging's opening documentary about the death penalty and the subsequent absurdist reenactments of the crime. The visuality and textures of realism, I think, have their place, but the trompe-l'oeism for its own sake is just not the wave. But as I said earlier, I think there's this willful ignorance around film's ability to index reality and how that led artists who mitigate their work on screen and see that as a virtue. And that's really just dumb. Vibration cinema celebrates the myriad of ways that we can express or evoke or play or present anything visually. What one might call its metaphoric punch. After all, why would I watch your movie if there's nothing to watch? And I hope you guys are excited to watch our next episode, which will either be on Larry Clark's Passing Through and Cinematic Jazz or a Bradford Young retrospective. See you all in Black History Month. Love you madly. Bye.
For the past 17 minutes, I've been lying my head off.
No, what we professional liars hope to serve is truth. I'm afraid the pompous word for that is art. Picasso himself said it. Art, he said, is a lie. A lie that makes us realize the truth.